Marianna, thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to join us today. I know you didn't know whether you could actually make it until not long before this, but tell us a little bit about your role here at the BBC. First of all, how did you get into journalism in the first place, but then how did it develop into this rather unique role, investigating social media stories?
Yeah, it's one of those jobs that when you're little, you probably don't imagine will be your job 20 years later. And thank you so much for having me. So I was someone who's always interested in journalism, and I guess I'm also the first generation that really grew up with social media. So I got Instagram, Facebook when I was 14. I did quite a lot for my local paper, various other bits of work experience for newspapers, Private Eye, which was really exciting. And I studied French and Russian at university, so I was always quite interested in propaganda and disinformation and how all of that works. And I started first here at the BBC at Newsnight. I was booking guests, doing shifts, that kind of thing, and started pitching social media investigations. And the way this job really came to exist was during and after the 2019 general election, there was this decision within news that actually it'd be really good to commit reporters to looking into the way that social media is shaping democratic events. Remember, this is after the 2016 election, the Brexit referendum, all sorts of other stuff where people were asking questions about the impact social media can have. And so I did that in 2019, and then this job came to exist in the kind of its current iteration, I guess, in the February of 2020, so exactly 5 years ago. And it was with a view to covering the US election. But then the pandemic happened, and so I was forever busy.
Yeah. Well, I don't know where you find the time to do all the things that you do, because it's extraordinary. And anything can happen, as we're seeing at the moment in the news, anywhere in the world, and it's extraordinary, isn't it? How do you keep on top of things? Do you have a team behind you, or are you...
So I work with lots of different production teams. I'm part of BBC Verify and the wider team there. I often work, though, with, like you mentioned, sort of BBC Panorama, teams that work in long-form audio, so Radio 4 podcasts that I do, Americast, some work with sort of TV current affairs more generally, within news, the website, all sorts of stuff. So a lot of it is me doing the journalism and then matching up with great production teams who work with me. And I think to your point about how do you kind of keep on top of it all, because it's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole, really, if you decided to cover every single thing. And it's why I really favour longer form journalism in particular, because I think it allows you to investigate particular cases that are emblematic of the tactics at play or the real world consequences of disinformation, algorithms, hate. And so instead of going for every single thing, you're actually better educating listeners, readers in how this stuff works so they can spot it for themselves.
Right. So it's an educational piece.
Yeah, and I think also bringing it to life, I think sometimes this area can feel a little bit niche and a little bit geeky at times. And so I think that I find the audience, both younger and older audiences, and those that we don't always serve quite so much at the BBC, are really receptive to stuff that shows, the people harmed and affected, or why people believe this stuff and how they get drawn into conspiracy theories or trolling, and then also holding the social media companies accountable, which is not a very easy thing to do.
And it's getting harder, I imagine. What is the biggest challenge in getting to the truth behind social media, particularly social media viral kind of stuff? What's really hard for you?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I do is actually applying the same investigative journalism skills or principles to the social media world. So it's tracking people down, it's messaging dozens and dozens of people, it's following the anatomy of a post and working out where it first came from, and it's trying to speak to the different people affected, harmed, involved, get them to want to speak to you. I'd say the main challenges are when it comes to actually figuring out where something first came from. We're dealing with closed groups, we're dealing with channels that we don't always have access to on certain social media apps, we're dealing with social media companies that in some cases have become increasingly less transparent about where stuff is coming from, the data that we have access to, and the tools we have access to aren't the same as before. And then also social media companies who, in some cases, for example, X, don't respond anymore to right of reply requests like ever. I've had one response to upwards of dozens of emails I've sent them with allegations. So it's a really different relationship, and you can't get answers on things, and also that information is often not publicly available.
So what from a technology point of view, what kind of tools do you use, do you find useful? And where could you utilize, where do you need innovation to happen to help you more in some of your methods?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of it, like I say, is just, messaging loads of people, joining different groups, following and searching out different types of content. And a lot of that you can do manually. And the same applies for sort of adding up numbers and working out, how much stuff has been shared. Again, sometimes the data from the companies themselves isn't that reliable, and you have to do this stuff by hand, really.
Yeah.
Things that used to be really useful. So there was a program called CrowdTangle, which allowed us to... CrowdTangle. It was Meta, so Facebook and Instagram's platform that allowed you to look at like how something had been shared within groups. It kind of pulled together a lot of data from the sites, and actually it worked for different places like Twitter as well. That doesn't exist in the way that it did before, and therefore there are real limitations to how you can gather together that data and how transparent the companies are about that. Something like X as well, Twitter, used to be a bit more transparent about the data that you could have access to and what you could find. That's not the case anymore. So I think anything that improves that transparency is good. A lot of that is kind of on the social media companies themselves, but tools that allow you particularly to, a lot of the stories I investigate, there are two bars that they have to cross at least one of them. One is that it's sufficiently viral and is reaching a significant number of people, and therefore we want to investigate it and expose what's happened. The other is that it's had a real world impact or triggered some kind of real world harm or affected people. And for the first one, often a lot of that is really time consuming and manual. I talk to the data team quite a lot, and there aren't really any neat shortcuts.
No.
So, and not that we like shortcuts, obviously, but anything that allows you to but better sort of collate those numbers and gather that stuff together is really good, and to also ascertain the provenance of a post or where it's come from. I think the other thing is just more generally being able to get questions answered by the social media companies. Like anything that allows you to better hold them accountable is a good thing.
The likes of Meta and others are drawing back from fact-checking. And is that going to cause you more kind of difficulties in getting to the truth, or is that ever going to come back, do you think? Is this them, they've gone that way forever?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So if you look at it from a political point of view, and we've been chatting quite a lot about it on Americast, but Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg appear to be, certainly Elon Musk, closer to Donald Trump, and some of the decisions they're making are in line with what he sees are key principles, particularly around the issue of freedom of expression. So the decision by Meta to swap from fact-checking to community notes in America appears to be part of that strategy. It's very hard to get inside the heads of these social media bosses. When you look at Elon Musk at the moment, who enjoys being a bit of a troll, a self-styled troll, and he'll say that himself, there's a big question mark over how ideological what he's doing is, or whether he doesn't really care about the consequences, how that works. With Mark Zuckerberg, if you look at his track record, and I've spoken to quite a lot of people who have worked with him and worked inside the social media companies, and Musk too, they would say, well, actually, a lot of this is about strategy, a lot of it is about money, which is what almost everything comes back to when we're talking about the social media companies, although they would disagree with me and say that that's not the case when they reply to me. What I would say is that I think that you've got a real difference now between what's happening in the United States, particularly the bosses that are based there and the companies that are based there, but companies that people all over the world, sites that people all over the world use, and then here in the United Kingdom, where we've got the Online Safety Act, although there are questions about its efficacy and implementation, and then places like Australia as well, where they've approved this idea to ban social media for under 16s. So you've got this kind of divergence happening, and I think that makes it quite hard to predict what's going to happen next and where we go. And
in each region, it's going to be different.
And how what that ends up looking like, and how possible some of these solutions are or not, and whether from speaking to people within the social media companies, and specifically about this rowing back of the fact checking. And I find this as well. I think that while fact checking is something that can be really useful, there are valid examples of where policies have been applied perhaps incorrectly on the social media sites, and that's fueled some people's idea that fact checkers or moderators are biased, that they're not fair, and that can be a bad thing, because then people almost see a fact check as a sign that something isn't true rather than it being true, and it entrenches what they believe. I also think that ultimately almost everything I investigate at the moment, whether it was around the elections last year, whether it was about the harm caused by conspiracy theory movements or to kids and teenagers, comes back to actually the fundamental design and model of the social media sites. And all that fact-checking really does, and quite a lot of the insiders I've spoken to who've worked on these kinds of programs say, is like it's a bit like a plaster. It's a kind of added thing that people who are in the middle, who might not have made their mind up about something, might spot and say, oh, okay, maybe that's not true. But ultimately, it doesn't fix the issue of how this kind of content is being amplified and recommended and pushed to millions of people. And I think most people would accept that and actually from a freedom of expression point of view, it's good that people can say all sorts of things. The difference is that if you're saying those things to one person and no one's seeing them, or if you're saying them to 30 million people, and that's where the real world impact comes in. And so actually, fact-checking on its own is not nearly enough to remedy the issue of the way that these algorithmic systems prioritize engagement over all else, including accuracy and including safety. Right. And it would come at huge financial cost to the companies to really do something about that. Again, they would disagree with me.
Yeah. So what, in your view, will AI be more of a danger in terms of proliferating fake news and misinformation, disinformation? Or will it become more of a tool that actually you could utilize and harness to fight some of these things?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to AI, last year particularly, because of the number of elections all around the world, there was a lot of concern about the way AI could be abused to spread stuff that's not true and convince people of things people have said or done that haven't happened. I very helpfully predicted this on Americast earlier in the year, so I'll keep mentioning it. There are lots of other predictions we got very wrong. It was that actually AI is just another thing that adds to this already incredibly chaotic ecosystem, for want of a better word, on social media. And a lot of the tactics that were used to spread disinformation effectively last year, they didn't even need AI. You know, they're using the same things, just posts, memes, videos. You don't even need to kind of fake this stuff. And again, a lot of it comes down to the algorithms, which are ultimately AI, pushing this content out, amplifying it, allowing it to reach people. And so you think about decisions that the bosses are making at the companies and the way those have impacted the proliferation of stuff that's not true. A lot of the AI-generated content was memes, pictures, stuff that reinforced existing ideas. Yeah. There are some examples of faked audio that was really quite convincing. I investigated one around
Sadiq Khan, I think.
Yeah. And the way that fueled tensions offline, suggesting he was going to move Remembrance Day commemorations to accommodate a pro-Palestinian rally. It wasn't real, but nonetheless, people who actually turned up and who were involved in counter-protests told me it was one of the reasons they'd come, because they believed it to be real. So there have been examples of where this kind of content has caused disruption or unrest.
It's come close to
but if you think
catching.
and if you think of the riots that happened in the summer, there was no need for AI-generated content. You know, the false name of the attacker and allegations about them being an asylum seeker spread like wildfire across social media because of a pseudo-news site and various other influencers, not because there was any kind of AI involved at all. Yeah. But what I would say, and looking at the research that the BBC did yesterday and that came out, and I know Deborah Turness wrote about it as well, there are other implications when it comes to AI, particularly the way that AI could mischaracterize or misrepresent news stories. It can aggregate them or rewrite them in a way that's false or misleading. Not only is that a problem in and of itself, but it also undermines trust in news brands, and that is one of the things we're really grappling with. So I think AI, also, if you think about AI, it's one of the tools that the social media companies use to detect content that's harmful or false. It is that there are solutions that lie within it as well.
Positive solutions.
Yeah, it's kind of the same in this domain as it is probably about everything, that there are good and bad bits. But what I would say is that we shouldn't let AI distract us from the already massive problems with the social media companies, because it's quite convenient for us all to kind of run after AI, and particularly the companies working on that, and to say, oh, the algorithms and all the other stuff don't matter so much anymore.
Yeah. This being a very technology audience, I think much of the talk of the last few years has been about C2PA, which is this content provenance initiative, which is, the BBC is very strongly behind it, along with some of the big tech players. And Google, for example, are part of it, and many others, Adobe and others. Kind of how important a tool could that be in authenticating content, or at least the provenance of content, where it comes from?
I think it's incredibly important because one of the things I think is crucial, and actually it kind of comes back to what we were saying about fact checking, is that people, and I hear this all the time from people I speak to who are affected by stuff that's not true or conspiracy theories, even just the average person who encounters this stuff, they want to feel empowered to be able to figure out where stuff has come from too, and news organizations want to be able to do that. Everybody does. Yeah. And so I think the more that we can equip people with the tools to be able to say, oh, okay, hang on, here's how I spot like where this actually came from, or I can figure out myself whether it's true or not. And the same applies within news organizations. The better that is for everyone. I think a lot of it comes down to like the design and how it works, and again, people feeling like they can trust it rather than reaching a point where some people then disbelieve the provenance and get yourself into all a bit of a pickle, which is the story of my life. But yeah, I think that anything that can help people and equip people and give people agency, and this is beyond journalists, I think just everybody, that is a really, really good thing. And I think that I find there is a real willingness from the audience, from people I speak to, from people listening and reading and watching, to be able to figure this stuff out for themselves. And so the more we can, I think, invest in the kinds of technology and measures that help people figure out where stuff has come from, the better. And the more we can also use that to protect, there's a lot of times where my identity, the BBC's identity, are misused to push stuff that's not true or never was said or didn't happen. And that obviously undermines trust. And so much of this is about people being able to trust us. And the more we can use it to also protect our content and the journalism we do, so that people understand that it's, of the standard they'd expect and it's not being abused. Because a lot of people don't believe stuff that's not true, but they just can't work out what to believe. And then they kind of almost disengage with all of this entirely because it's all too complicated, which is really understandable, but not good for any of us.
Yeah, I think in a world where certainly, my daughters and young people are moving away from traditional broadcast platforms, that's not to say they're not watching BBC online or wherever, but there's massive dangers out there, isn't there? And so education, coming back to that point, is going to be critical, isn't it, about what to look out for. Are there places that you recommend the industry that people could go to find out more about, whether something is real or not? Is there sources that you use that?
Yeah, I think one of the best things that people can actually do, and this definitely applies for sort of teenagers and kids as well, is to better equip themselves to be able to spot this stuff. And I just think the more that people are empowered, like a lot of belief in stuff that's not true comes from people actually wanting agency and people wanting to say, I've figured this out for myself. They don't want people to be telling them to the kind of way that fact-checking can backfire. They don't want people to be saying, well, this is right and this is wrong, and they're not really up for that. They actually want to be able to figure it out. And social media has allowed people to be able to kind of navigate these spaces and worlds themselves all the time. I did this panorama back in September that was kind of about kids and smartphones, and I spoke to some insiders from the social media companies about what algorithms are pushing young people, but also to an 18-year-old who said to me, oh, look, I get pushed all this stuff that I kind of don't want to see: hate, misogyny, violent content, and then also stuff where I just kind of can't work out whether it's true or not. And I think that the more we can talk not only about how do you spot this stuff, like, is it an emotional bit of content? Why has it been shared? Where has it come from? How viral is it? What platform? Helping people to critically analyze this stuff, but also helping, I think, people to understand the way that algorithms work. I think lots of people think when something's pushed to them, it means that it must be real or there must be a reason that it was sent to them, particularly teenagers, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's true at all. And the more people understand that, the better. The other thing I would say is, like Bite Size, Newsround, all of those places have great resources. We're doing some work with them as well to create more content. Yeah. And if you look at countries like Finland, where there's a pretty low belief in disinformation, there's also high trust in politicians and government, which we don't have here. Yeah. But there is, which to be honest, no one really has, so they're doing quite well for that. Yeah. But also, and this is part of the problem, trust across the board, sort of no political party in particular. Yeah. But also, they have a really good social media literacy programs in schools, and a lot of the people inside the companies I talk to point to how obviously the responsibility lies with the companies, but actually the more that we can just better equip people, and I see my role as part of that, then the better inoculated perhaps we are against the spread of bad stuff.
Yeah. Marianna, I mean, when you report on some of these programs, you must get an awful lot of backlash around some of the things that you say, right? How do you deal with that? You put your head above the parapet as the BBC's kind of face of tackling disinformation. How do you deal with it emotionally, this kind of backlash you get?
Yeah, I think I've very much accepted that it's the price of investigating this social media world. I'm often very deliberately talking to conspiracy theorists, sort of poking the beast a bit, and I accept that. I think that for me, a lot of the abuse I receive and threats are so extreme that it's very different from if someone just turned around and said, "Oh, I didn't like your podcast very much." In a weird way, that would be harder than someone saying, "You must eat babies and you're a devil," and et cetera, which I just know are not true. I think the one thing I would say on a kind of more serious note is that I think that a lot of people on social media in particular, and we could point to the bosses that we've been talking about, the companies, spend a lot of time talking about the importance of freedom of expression. I experience very extreme threats, misogynistic abuse, stuff that spills offline too, people turning up at the BBC, being abusive and threatening. I think of other colleagues I know who've experienced racism, homophobia, other forms of abuse, also colleagues who are threatened all over the world for the places they do their journalism. And I think it sets a really dangerous precedent when it's seen as basically fair game that journalists can be targeted with abuse and threats for what they do, particularly from people who say how much they value freedom of expression and yet are willing to quite happily either inflame or themselves spread hate and target people. Yeah. And if those kinds of things were happening anywhere else, I think we'd all be quite appalled. But for some reason in democracy here, it's sort of like, oh yeah, journalists just get abused and that's that. And I don't think that's necessarily what it should be like, which is why I talk about it a lot, because in some ways it's part of understanding the tactics of this world and the hypocrisy that's often at play as well. Yeah.
Marianna, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Keep up this amazing work, because what you're doing is extraordinary. So thank you for coming and sharing some of your kind of day-to-day life with us. And I'm sure this audience here would love to help you with tools and technologies that can further empower you. So thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it, and good luck with everything. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you.